That's the title of this story. But what you're about to hear is far more unbelievable than any headline. One morning, I stepped outside my home, and I saw them lined up on my lawn. 5 men in green, and 1 man in a suit. They didn't come to talk. They came to take everything. And what happened next changed the fate of the entire neighborhood. Stay with me, because this story doesn't end where you think it will. Welcome back to HOA Stories. My name is Daniel. I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Arizona. I'm just a regular guy. I work hard, I keep to myself, and all I ever wanted was a little peace on my own property. But the HOA had other plans. This is how it all began. I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Arizona. The kind of place where every driveway looks the same, where the lawns are trimmed like soldiers, and where the HOA believes they are kings of the street. I never wanted trouble. I never wanted war with anyone. All I wanted was to enjoy my home, my land, my small piece of peace. But peace is the one thing the HOA does not allow. It started small. Letters in the mailbox. A reminder about the trash can left out for 2 hours too long. A note about my grass looking uneven after a storm. Warnings about my car being parked too close to the curb. Petty. Ridiculous. Insulting. At first, I laughed it off. I thought, maybe they just had nothing better to do. But soon, it became clear. This was not about rules. This was about control. The president of the HOA, a woman named Carol, had eyes everywhere. She drove her golf cart around like a sheriff, stopping in front of houses, scribbling notes on her clipboard. Sometimes she didn't even look at you. She would just smile that cold smile, as if she was saying, "I own you," for a while. I stayed quiet, but then came the shed I built. It myself with my own hands, a place for my tools, for storage, for little projects I wanted to do. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't ugly. It was just a shed on my land. But the moment it stood, the letters began again. This structure has not been approved. This shed must be removed immediately. This is a violation of HOA guidelines. I read their letters again and again, but something didn't make sense. There was no rule about sheds, no clear line that said I couldn't have one. They wanted me to tear it down simply because I didn't beg for permission. And that's when I decided I wasn't going to move an inch. The war began. At first, they fined me $25 a day, then $50. Then they threatened to place a lien on my property. Neighbors whispered. Some told me to just give up. Others cheered quietly from behind their curtains. But nobody stood with me openly because everyone was afraid of them. One night, as I walked out to take the trash, I found a folded note tucked under my windshield wiper. It wasn't signed, but I knew who it was from. Play smart. Tear it down, or you will regret this. No name, no contact. Just that message. I stared at it under the dim streetlight, my hands shaking, not with fear, but with anger. Days passed. Letters kept coming. The HOA called a meeting just to talk about me. I wasn't invited, but word spread. They called me the rebel. They said I was destroying the harmony of the neighborhood. All for a simple wooden shed. Then came that morning. The sun had barely risen. I was drinking coffee by the window. And then I saw them, 5 men in green polo shirts, khaki pants, standing shoulder to shoulder. Behind them, a man in a black suit holding a folder. They marched down my driveway like soldiers invading foreign land. The lawyer shouted my name, telling me I was in violation, telling me I had no rights. The inspectors spread across my yard, taking photos, writing notes, pointing at my shed. I stepped outside, shotgun in my hands, not pointing it at anyone, just holding it. Firmly. "This is my property," I said. The lawyer smirked. "We'll see you in court." That line by you burned in my chest. "We'll see you in court," as if he had already won, as if the decision was his to make. But I didn't back down. I stood tall, even as neighbors peeked through blinds, even as I felt every eye on the street watching. The standoff didn't last long. They left after their little show of power, but the damage was done. The war was now public, and I had a target on my back. From that day on, every walk to the mailbox felt like a gamble. Would it be another fine? Would it be another threat? Or worse, a legal notice each night? I wondered if they would try to take me down some other way. If they would drag me to court and bleed me dry in fees, I wondered. How far would they go? And how far? I was willing to fight. Because, you see, this wasn't just about a shed anymore. It wasn't about grass, or trash cans, or parking. It was about freedom. It was about standing up against a group that thought they could own me. And I knew one thing. If they wanted a fight, I would give them one. The next days felt heavy. Like a storm was waiting above my roof. Ready to fall any moment, I couldn't relax. Not even for a second. Every time a car slowed near my house, I thought it was them. Every time the mail truck stopped, I expected another threat. Then it came. A thick envelope. Heavier than any letter I had received before. The HOA had filed a lawsuit against me. They wanted thousands in fines, plus legal costs. They claimed my shed was a violation of community harmony. They said it reduced property values. They said it made the neighborhood look cheap. I held those papers in my hands, and for the first time, I felt something stronger than fear. I felt it insulted. They were calling my hard work, my pride, trash, and I wasn't about to let them win. I hired a lawyer, not an expensive one, not the kind that drives fancy cars, but a good man, sharp, serious, the kind that hates bullies. He listened to me quietly, read through the papers, and then smiled. "They don't have a case," he said. And for the first time in weeks, I could breathe. But breathing was not enough, because the HOA didn't stop. While the court date was being set, they kept pushing. Inspectors circled my house like vultures. Neighbors told me the board was spreading lies, saying I was a danger, a troublemaker, a criminal in the making, and the president herself, Carol, made sure to stop her golf cart in front of my house every evening. She wouldn't wave. She wouldn't speak. She would just sit there for a moment, staring. That cold smile on her lips. And then she would drive away. It was psychological warfare, a battle of patience. They wanted me to snap. They wanted me to make a mistake, but I didn't. Instead, I prepared. The night before the court hearing, I walked around my yard. The shed stood tall in the moonlight, silent, stubborn, unbroken. I touched the wood with my hand, and I swore to myself I would defend it like it was part of me, because in many ways, it was. The next morning, I walked into that courtroom. The air was heavy. The board members were there, the lawyer in his black suit. Piles of folders stacked high on the table. They looked confident, almost cocky, like they had already won, like I was just another name on their list, but I had something they didn't. The truth. The judge entered. The room fell silent. The HOA lawyer stood up. He spoke for nearly an hour, waving papers in the air, showing photos of my shed, painting me as a reckless homeowner tearing apart the neighborhood. Rude, he called me defiant, disruptive, a problem for the community. And all the while, I sat still, watching, waiting. When it was finally my turn, I stood slowly. I looked at the judge, and I spoke simply. I told him about my shed, my work, my right to my land. I told him there was no rule against it, no line in their book that said I couldn't build it. I told him how they fined me, threatened me, humiliated me. I didn't have fancy words, but I had honesty. My lawyer placed the HOA's own documents in front of the judge. He showed him the rules, page after page. Not a single one mentioned sheds, not one. For a long moment, the judge said nothing. The room was silent. I could see sweat on the lawyer's forehead. I could see Carol shifting uncomfortably in her seat. And then, the judge leaned forward. His voice was calm, sharp, final. "There is no violation here." It was like thunder rolling through the room. The HOA lawyer froze. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Carol's smile disappeared for the first time, and I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Victory. But that wasn't the end, because after the ruling, after the fines were erased, something unexpected happened. The judge wasn't finished. He looked directly at the HOA lawyer, and he scolded them. He told them the court's time had been wasted. He told them the board had acted without cause, with arrogance, with malice, and in that moment, the power they thought they had crumbled. I walked out of that courtroom free. But something told me this war was not over, because when bullies lose, they don't vanish. They plot. They wait. They come back stronger. When I walked out of that courtroom, I thought it was over. I thought I had won. Once and for all, the judge had crushed them. The fines were gone. And my shed still stood tall in my yard. For the first time in months, I felt free. But freedom in this neighborhood doesn't last long. The HOA does not forget, and they do not forgive. I've especially not Carol. The president, her pride had been shattered in front of everyone. Her power had been broken by a single word from a judge, and I could see it in her eyes as I passed her outside that courthouse. She wasn't smiling anymore, but her silence was worse than any smile. For a few days, things were quiet. No letters, no fines, no notes. I thought maybe they had finally learned their lesson. I cut my grass. I parked my car. I walked my dog just like always. Life almost felt normal, but peace, in this place, is always just the calm before the storm. One morning, as I stepped outside with my coffee, I noticed something odd. The inspectors were back, not in my yard this time, but in my neighbor's, measuring his fence, photographing his flower beds, writing on their little clipboards. It didn't take long before other houses were targeted too. Everywhere I looked, inspectors crawling around like ants. But strangely, not a single one came near Carol's house. It was clear what was happening. They couldn't touch me right away, not after losing in court, so they tightened the rules on everyone else. They wanted the whole neighborhood to feel their control, to fear them again, and they wanted me to be the villain. The whisper began to spread. That's the guy who made them stricter. That's the man who ruined it for all of us. I could see it in the way neighbors looked at me, some with sympathy, others with anger. The divide was growing. The board had lost in court, but they were winning in the shadows. Then came the letters again, not about the shed this time. They said my fence was too tall, my mailbox was too faded, my porch light was not approved by HOA standards. It didn't matter that my fence was the same as every other fence, or that my mailbox looked just fine. They were looking for cracks, any excuse to bleed me dry with. It's fines again? My lawyer told me to ignore the noise. He said they had no ground, no rule that could hold up in court. But I knew this wasn't about court anymore. It was about pressure, about making my life miserable until I gave up. One night, as I was sitting in my living room, I heard footsteps outside. I opened the door and saw nothing. But when I looked down, there was another note on my doorstep. No envelope, no name, just a message. You humiliated us once. You won't do it again. I folded that paper slowly, and I realized something. This wasn't just a fight about rules anymore. This was personal. Days turned into weeks, and the harassment grew. Cars slowing down in front of my house at night. Mysterious phone calls with no one speaking on the other end. My trash cans tipped over every morning. I couldn't prove it was them. But I didn't need proof. I knew. The tension in the neighborhood grew worse. Neighbors stopped talking to me. Some even crossed the street when they saw me coming. It was working. The HOA was turning everyone against me, and I was becoming the outcast of my own street. But here's the thing about me. I don't back down. If they wanted war, I would give them one. But this time, I wouldn't just defend myself. I would expose them. I started watching, listening, taking notes. When Carol drove her golf cart, I noted the times. When inspectors walked into yards they weren't allowed in, I took photos. When neighbors whispered about unfair fines, I wrote it down, piece by piece. I began building a record, not of my shed, not of my fence, but of their abuse, their lies, their corruption. The more I dug, the more I found the HOA was fining people without proof. They were bending rules for their friends and breaking them for their enemies. They were using HOA funds, money from all of us, for their own parties and dinners. It was a system of control, not a system of community. And I realized something powerful. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for everyone. They had crushed under their boots, but the more evidence I gathered, the more dangerous it became. One night, as I was writing at my desk, I heard a loud bang outside. I rushed to the door and found my mailbox smashed on the ground, the wood split. The metal bent in half, and spray-painted across the side of my fence were 3 words: "Drop the shed." I stood there in the dark, staring at the wreckage, and for the first time, I wondered how far they were willing to go. Would they stop at intimidation, or would they come after me directly the next morning? Carol drove by slowly in her golf cart. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just looked at me, and then at the broken mailbox, and then she drove away. It was clear this wasn't going to stop until one of us broke. I fixed the mailbox. I cleaned the fence, but I left one piece of the spray paint untouched. The word "shed" still faintly visible on the wood. Every time I walked past it, I reminded myself, this is what they fear, this is what gives me strength, and now I had a decision to make. Would I take my evidence and bring them down in the open? Would I risk everything to expose their corruption, or would I keep fighting in silence? Waiting for their next move, the evidence kept piling up. Every day I found something new, some mistake, some abuse, some secret the HOA didn't want anyone to see. It was almost too easy, almost like they thought nobody would ever dare to look. I had photos of inspectors stepping into private yards without permission, copies of letters where the rules were twisted against some, but ignored for others, receipts showing HOA funds being used for social dinners at expensive restaurants. Dinners attended only by the board and their friends. I even had recordings of neighbors complaining about being fined for things that weren't even violations. And all of it was now in my hands. But the more I uncovered, the more dangerous it became. One night, I noticed a car parked across the street from my house. Lights off, engine silent. It sat there for hours. When I finally walked outside with my phone in hand, ready to record, it drove away without headlights. That's when I realized. They knew I was digging, and they were watching me. The fear was real, but so was the fire inside me. I wasn't just fighting for my shed anymore. I was fighting for every single neighbor who had been bullied into silence. And I knew the only way to win was to strike first. So I made a plan. I decided to attend the next HOA meeting, not as a quiet homeowner sitting in the back, but as someone ready to confront them in the open. For weeks, they had avoided mentioning me directly in public. They wanted to paint me as the troublemaker, but without ever giving me a voice. That was about to change when the day came. I walked into that meeting hall with a folder under my arm. The room was full. Neighbors lined the chairs. Board members at the front table. Carol sat in the middle, her eyes sharp, her cold smile back on her lips. The meeting began like always. Boring talk about landscaping budgets, mailbox repairs, community events. But I wasn't listening. I was waiting. And then, the floor opened for homeowner concerns. That was my moment. I stood up slowly, folder in hand. All eyes turned toward me. Carol tried to move on quickly, tried to cut me off, but it was too late. I raised my voice louder than I ever had before, and I spoke. I told them about the lies, the false fines, the intimidation, the misuse of funds. I pulled out the receipts, the letters, the photos. I showed everyone what I had discovered, one piece at a time. Gasps filled the room. Murmurs spread across the crowd. Neighbors who had been silent for years, now whispering loudly, now pointing fingers at the board. Carol tried to shut me down. She banged her gavel. She shouted that I was out of order, but I didn't stop, because for the first time, I wasn't alone. Voices rose behind me. Other neighbors began speaking up, telling their own stories, adding fuel to the fire. It was like a dam breaking. The fear that had held this neighborhood captive was crumbling. By the time the meeting ended, the board was shaken. Carol's smile was gone, replaced with rage. The lawyer at her side whispered frantically, flipping through papers as if searching for a lifeline. But there was no lifeline, because the truth was out that night. My phone buzzed non-stop, neighbors thanking me, some even apologizing for staying quiet for so long. For the first time in months, I didn't feel alone. I felt like maybe, just maybe, we had a chance to bring them down. But I also knew the board wouldn't go quietly. They had money, power, and most of all, pride. And people like that, when cornered, become dangerous. The very next morning, I woke up to find my yard trashed, eggs on my windows, toilet paper in my trees, spray paint on my driveway spelling the word traitor. It was childish, petty, But it was also a message. They were telling me. I had crossed the line. I cleaned it up quietly. But inside, I was boiling. If this was the best they had, then they were weaker than I thought, and I was ready for whatever came next. The following week, things escalated again. I received a letter not from the HOA, but from their lawyer directly, a cease and desist. They accused me of slander, of harassment, of defaming the integrity of the board. They threatened to sue me if I didn't back down. It was intimidation on paper, nothing more, but it was meant to scare me, to break me. Instead, it gave me more fuel. I shared the letter with my lawyer. He laughed. He told me it was empty. Just another attempt to silence me, but he also warned me. They're desperate now, and desperate people make mistakes. He was right, because only a few days later, I caught them, late at night. Headlights flashed across my window. I looked out and saw 2 inspectors sneaking into my yard. They were taking photos again, measuring, touching the shed. I grabbed my phone, hit record, and walked outside. The look on their faces when they realized I was filming, priceless. They scrambled, stumbling back, muttering excuses, before running into their truck and speeding off into the night. And I had it all on video. That was the final piece I needed. Not just documents, not just whispers, but proof. Proof they were trespassing. Proof they were harassing. Proof they were breaking the very laws they claimed to uphold. Now, the question was, what to do with it. I could take it straight to court. Or I could take it to the neighbors first, show them everything, build an army before striking back. Either way, the board's days were numbered. They thought they were untouchable, but I was about to show them. Nobody is untouchable. The video changed everything. For weeks they had called me a liar, a troublemaker, a man who hated the rules. But now, I had proof. Proof they had stepped onto my land. Proof they had broken the very laws they swore to protect, and I knew exactly what to do with it. I started knocking on doors, one neighbor at a time, one story at a time. I showed them the video. I showed them the photos. I showed them the receipts. And slowly, something incredible began to happen. Fear turned into anger. Anger turned into courage. People who had stayed silent for years now wanted to fight. Mothers who had been fined for toys in their yards. Elderly couples who had been threatened over weeds. Even families who had paid thousands in bogus fines. They all began to speak. It wasn't just my war anymore. It was our war. By the end of the week, we had a small army. We met quietly in garages, in living rooms. Away from Carol's spies, we compared letters. We collected stories. We built a case so big it could bury the entire board. And in those meetings, something shifted inside me. For the first time, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a leader. But Carol wasn't blind. She saw the shift. She saw the unity growing, and she hated it. The harassment doubled. My car was keyed in the night. Deep scratches carved across the paint. A dead rat left on my doorstep wrapped in newspaper. Phone calls at midnight. Voices whispering and then hanging up. It was dirty. It was ugly. But it only proved one thing. They were afraid. The next HOA meeting was packed. Not like before. Not the quiet crowd that listened in fear. This time, the room buzzed with energy, with anger. Dozens of neighbors stood ready. When the board tried to start, voices rose, questions flew across the room. Where is our money going? Why do you fine us for things that aren't in the rules? Why are inspectors trespassing into our yards? The board looked shaken. Carol banged her gavel again and again, screaming for order. But the people weren't listening anymore. And then, I stood up, I pulled out my phone, and I played the video for everyone. The room went silent as the screen lit up. 2 inspectors creeping through my yard, caught red-handed, running like cowards when I confronted them. Gasps filled the hall. Whispers turned into shouts. Even the lawyer at the board's table looked pale, for the first time. Carol had no words. Her cold smile was gone, replaced with a look I had never seen before. Fear, the meeting collapsed into chaos. Neighbors demanding resignations, others shouting for an audit, some even calling for the police. Carol slammed her gavel until her hand turned red, but the noise swallowed her whole. The board had lost control. Oh, that night, I felt something I hadn't felt since the very beginning. Hope. But hope can be dangerous, because the closer you get to victory, the more desperate the enemy becomes. The very next morning, I woke to flashing lights outside my house. Police cars lined the street, neighbors standing in their driveways, pointing, whispering. I stepped outside, confused, and an officer walked up to me. "Sir, we received a report of illegal weapons on your property." My heart sank. I knew exactly what this was, a setup. They searched my shed. They searched my house. They searched my car. Neighbors watched as if I were a criminal. But they found nothing, because there was nothing to find. The officers apologized, said they were just following up on a tip, but the damage was done. That tip had been planted, designed to humiliate me in front of everyone. Another move in Carol's war. That night, I sat in my shed, the walls closing in around me for the first time. I asked myself if it was worth it. The fines, the harassment, the danger. Was it worth standing up? Or should I have just torn the shed down when they first asked? But then I looked around, at the wood I had cut, the nails I had driven, the hours I had poured into building it. It wasn't just a shed, it was proof that I still had control over my own life. And I wasn't about to let them take that from me, so I doubled down. We gathered more evidence, more stories, more documents. Neighbors started coming to me with files of their own. I wasn't just one man fighting anymore. I was the center of something bigger, a movement. And Carol knew it. She started showing up outside my house again, sitting in her golf cart at sunset, staring, not smiling anymore, but glaring, as if she knew her empire was cracking, and all she had left was intimidation. But intimidation doesn't work on me anymore, because I had the truth. I had the people. I had the proof. And soon, we would take it where it mattered most, to the courtroom. But before we stepped into that fight, I couldn't stop thinking about one thing. How far would they go to protect their power? Would they stop at lies, at harassment, at false police reports? Or would they go further, darker, into places I wasn't ready to face? Because when people like this lose control, they don't just fight, they destroy. And as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak and every whisper of the house, I knew the storm wasn't over. It was only beginning. The days after the false police call felt heavier than ever. The air in the neighborhood was different. Neighbors still waved at me. Some even whispered words of support. But there was also fear in their eyes, because they all knew. If the HOA could try to frame me, they could do it to anyone. But fear didn't stop me. If anything, it made me sharper. I knew the board would not stop until I was broken, so I decided. Neither would I. The evidence we had collected was now a mountain, fines that didn't exist in the rules, receipts of money spent on personal dinners, photos of inspectors trespassing, my video of them caught red-handed in my yard, and more than anything, the voices of dozens of neighbors finally ready to speak. It was time to turn defense into offense. We filed a lawsuit, not just me, but several of us together. It wasn't about one shed anymore. It was about years of abuse, intimidation, and corruption. We were tired of being ruled by fear, and now we had the proof to strike back. The board was furious. Carol stormed into the next meeting like a general marching into battle, her face red, her voice sharp, her gavel slamming again and again. She called me a liar, called us all liars, accused us of trying to destroy the community. But the louder she shouted, the weaker she looked, because everyone and that room knew the truth now. The board's lawyer tried to calm her, tried to spin the story, but there was no spinning left to do. We had stripped them bare, and yet they didn't back down. Instead, they grew more vicious. One night, I woke to the sound of glass shattering. I ran outside and found my car windows smashed in, the seats slashed, the dashboard broken. Spray painted across the hood were 3 words: "Know your place." I stood there in the dark, fists clenched, heart pounding. It was one thing to find me. It was another to attack my property like cowards in the night. And I knew it wouldn't stop here. The next morning, police came again. But this time, it wasn't for me. Neighbors had reported vandalism on their homes too. Broken lights, destroyed mailboxes, trash dumped on lawns. It was spreading. The board was lashing out at anyone who dared to stand with me. But here's the thing about fear. It can silence people, or it can harden them. And this time, it hardened them instead of backing down. More neighbors joined us. We weren't just a small group anymore. We were a force. We met in larger homes now, filling living rooms with people who were tired of being treated like prisoners on their own land. Every voice added more fuel. Every story made our case stronger. And slowly, the power shifted. But Carol saw it too. And when people like her lose power, they become reckless. One evening, I was working in my yard, fixing the broken fence, and I saw her golf cart coming down the street. She stopped in front of my driveway. But this time, she didn't just sit there with that cold smile. She got out. She walked right up to me, closer than she had ever dared before, her eyes burning, her hands shaking. "You don't know who you're messing with," she hissed. "You think you can beat us, but you're nothing." Her voice was low, almost trembling with rage, and then she leaned closer. "You should be careful. Accidents happen." I froze. It wasn't just intimidation anymore, or it was a threat. She turned, climbed back into her cart, and drove away into the night, and I stood there, staring at the empty street, wondering how far this would go. For the first time, I felt real danger, not just fines, not just harassment, but the possibility that this war could turn into something darker, something violent. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window, shotgun resting across my lap, watching the street until the sun came up, because I knew she meant it. But fear doesn't control me anymore. If anything, it only fueled me further. When we walked into that courtroom weeks later, it wasn't just me versus the board. It was dozens of homeowners versus corruption. The room was packed. Reporters had even shown up after whispers spread about the case, and for the first time, Carol and her board didn't look powerful. They looked small. The judge listened carefully. Our lawyer laid out the evidence piece by piece, the receipts, the false fines, the photos, the video. One by one, the truth landed like hammer strikes, and each time, the board shrank deeper into their chairs. Carol tried to speak, tried to twist the story, but the judge cut her off again and again, until finally, her voice broke. She wasn't the queen of the neighborhood anymore. She was just another bully caught in the light. And I sat there, watching her unravel, the same woman who once drove past my house with that cold smile, now sweating, shaking, defeated. It was justice in slow motion. And yet, it wasn't over. Because when you bring down people like this, they don't just vanish, they take everyone with them. They set fires on their way out. And that was the danger now. The trial wasn't finished yet, but the weight of victory was already on our side. And I couldn't help but think, what would Carol do, knowing her empire was crumbling, knowing Ruth was about to bury her? Would she surrender quietly, or would she go down swinging, trying to drag me and everyone else into the flames with her? The courtroom felt colder that day, not because of the air, but because of the weight in the room. Everyone could feel it. This wasn't just another HOA dispute anymore. It was a war, and today it was reaching its end. I sat in the front row, my folder of evidence beside me. Behind me, rows of neighbors filled the benches, mothers, fathers, elderly couples, families who had been silent for too long. Now, they were here to see justice. The board sat across from us, Carol in the center, stiff, pale, her smile gone completely, the lawyer beside her, drowning in stacks of papers that meant nothing anymore. They looked like rulers stripped of their crowns, desperate, cornered. The judge entered, and silence fell, the air so thick you could hear every cough, every nervous shuffle. It was the kind of silence before a storm breaks. Our lawyer spoke first. His voice was calm, steady. He didn't shout. He didn't wave his hands. He simply laid out the truth. One brick at a time. False fines, illegal trespassing, misuse of funds, harassment. Every piece backed with proof, every point cutting deeper than the last. And then, he played the video, the inspectors sneaking into my yard, caught in the act, running when confronted. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. The judge leaned forward, expression hardening. When it was their turn, the HOA lawyer tried to fight back. He called me reckless, called us liars, said we were exaggerating, but every word sounded weaker than the last, because the truth was already out, and truth, once spoken, cannot be buried again. Then came the moment I will never forget. The judge turned to Carol directly. He asked her one simple question. Did your board knowingly fine homeowners for rules that did not exist? She froze. Her lips trembled. Her eyes darted across the room. She opened her mouth, but no words came out, and in that silence, everything crumbled. The judge slammed his gavel, his voice sharp, echoing off the walls. This board has acted in bad faith, with intimidation, with corruption, and with disregard for the law. It was over. The fines were erased, the liens canceled, the misuse of funds ordered to be repaid, the board dissolved. Carol sat there in shock, her face pale as the judge stripped her of the power she had clung to for years. Her empire, gone in a single stroke of the gavel. I should have felt joy. I should have celebrated, and part of me did. But another part of me felt something else, something heavier. Because when people like Carol fall, they don't just disappear, they leave scars. As we walked out of that courtroom, neighbors clapped my back, shook my hand, thanked me again and again. Some said I was a hero. Others said I had saved the neighborhood. But I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a man who had simply refused to bow down. That night, the street was quiet. For the first time in months, no inspectors, no notes, no golf carts circling like a vulture. My shed stood under the moonlight, untouched, unchallenged, and I sat on my porch, finally breathing freely. But even in victory, I couldn't forget the war, the smashed mailbox, the dead rat, the spray paint, the false police call, the look in Carol's eyes when she threatened me. Those memories don't vanish with a court ruling. They linger. They remind you of how far some people will go for power, and yet, they also remind you of something else, that standing up, even when you're alone, even when you're outnumbered, can change everything. I looked at my neighborhood differently after that. The lawns still neat, the mailboxes still lined up, the rules still printed on paper. But now, people smiled more. They waved without fear. They talked in the open. But instead of whispering in secret, the shadows were gone. At least for now. Carol left. Her house sold within weeks. Rumors said she moved to another state. Maybe she thought she could start over somewhere else. But I knew, no matter where she went, she would never wear that cold smile the same way again. And me. I stayed, because this was my home, my land, my shed, and I wasn't going anywhere, sometimes. I still wonder what would have happened if I had torn it down that first day, if I had bowed my head, paid the fine, let them win. Life would have been quieter, easier, safer, but it wouldn't have been mine. And that's the truth about places like this. You don't just fight for your house, you fight for your freedom. So now I leave you with this. If the HOA stormed your property, with inspectors, with lawyers, with threats, and told you to destroy something you built with your own hands, would you fight until the very end like I did? Or would you give in to keep your peace?